Hi, I'm Sasha, and you're listening to Queer Conversations brought to you by Lesbians on the Loose. Adrien Moffett is a non-binary American who grew up in the Southern Bible Belt. They decided to move to Australia so they could live openly with their partner. Adrien, thank you so much for joining us today. I guess, just to start off, what's your name? How old are you? Where are you from? And how do you identify?
Yep, so I am 28 years old. My name's Adrien. I am originally from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. I've lived in Australia for nearly a decade now. I identify as non-binary, so I use they, them pronouns.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit more about your upbringing and how you're growing up?
Yeah, so growing up was I have very mixed nostalgia and fear from that time. So I grew up in a very conservative community in the southern United States. My family is Southern Baptist. It was a very rigorous, disciplined household, and the community surrounding that was actually quite intense as well. So there were a lot of challenges in terms of expression growing up and identity, and certainly around sexual orientation was a huge, huge issue.
That would have been very challenging. I mean, because I was going to say, how did you come out and when did you come out?
So I came out to my parents in an email in September 2013. I was way too scared to face them about it. I was living at university in the time, and the university that I went to actually had a document that we had to sign called a covenant, and there were all of these rigorous kind of social upstandings we had to keep in order to be a part of the school. So I wasn't allowed to have any other types of expression in terms of my identity or orientation, or I would have gotten kicked out of school.
Oh,
so
gosh.
It was a really, really stressful time, and I remember kind of secretly going to my parents and saying, hey, I've met someone, and I think that this is something that I want to pursue. And they were not at all receptive to that conversation, and it actually led me moving to Australia. Prior to that conversation, I'd actually met an Australian. That's how I ended up moving out here. And we were deciding about where we wanted to live after I graduated from university at the end of 2013. And through the course of having those kind of coming out conversations to close family and a couple of close friends, I realized that I didn't really have a safe place there to express that. So I packed a suitcase and I came here.
I mean, it's interesting. Would you say that because there is that, I mean, as a foreigner, so a non-American, there is that reputation of the Midwest and the Southern Belt being super conservative and super religious. Can you just tell me a little bit more about, if you're comfortable to talk a little bit
Sure.
more about that?
It's a very interesting place. The South is, I have a lot of nostalgia for it because I was raised in the country, and it's a beautiful way to live and grow up, to explore the outdoors. I mean, I spent a lot of time as a child running around barefoot in the backyard, but in a lot of respects, it's very being monitored by a document that's nearly 2,500 years old. And so everything that you are doing is you need to match up to these set of standards. And if you don't fit in with that community, then you just leave. And so there's a reason, like, one of the selling points Georgia has, like, on its billboard when you visit is, like, you take a step back in time. And when you do take a step back in time, it's like, you get the good and the bad. The good is that it's this real slow paced, like, everyone's seems really easygoing, really cruisy. But the bad is that there are all of these really conservative ideologies that people have no interest in expanding their views upon.
Oh, actually, sorry, can I actually just go back a tick? Because did you identify as non-binary from the beginning, or?
I don't think I knew exactly what it was. I definitely had some questions about my identity and expression. I wasn't really very comfortably allowed to explore those at that time. It wasn't really until I moved over here and I was kind of allowed, in terms of Australia just generally being a more open and accepting place, at least from my experience. Also from that freedom, being able to reshape my identity and kind of being able to seek things out that weren't available to me back home. But at the time, I didn't really know exactly what it was that I was feeling. I knew that I felt a little bit different, but it wasn't really safe to explore that.
Coming back to when we fast forward to you coming here, and just tell me a little bit more about when you initially came here, and then your career.
So I had a really, really lovely entry to Sydney. It was very lonely for a time, even though I was kind of thrown in the midst of my now ex, but my partner at the time. You know, she had quite a lot of friends and I was going out and doing a lot of things, but there was so much that was foreign and I was missing home a lot in a lot of ways that kind of felt conflicting for me because, you know, how could I miss this place that really wasn't all that great to me at times? You know, I kind of began to relinquish a bit of control over what was happening for me back home. Yeah, there's a million things happening. So I was able to go to lots of events, lots of like queer parties, dance parties, meeting a lot of people who are, you know, identify in a bunch of different ways and being able to hear different points of view, you know, being able to discuss that with people safely, you know, not really having an issue going into the city and being visibly queer or, you know, visibly in a relationship which, you know, doesn't appear to be heteronormative. So those were things that I was experiencing for the first time. There was this real rush of adrenaline that came with that. And I think after the adrenaline kind of wore off, it was more this swell of power and ownership and saying, you know, like I don't have to be afraid of this stuff anymore. Like now I can actually, instead of it being a defensive pursuit every time like I want to express myself, it allows me the power to say like I want to explore this. There are things that I feel or I'm interested in and I want to be able to chase down those avenues if they're available. And I found most of those here, you know, being able to like call people up and say, hey, have you heard of this? Or like, can I run something past you, and not really having that same fear of judgment. And
I think a lot of Sydney-siders in particular, and maybe for that matter, most metropolitan areas of Australia, our community, the queer community, sometimes forgets how, you know, how visible and how accessible queer venues and queer events are, don't you think? I think we sometimes forget by comparison to, I mean, what you're saying,
yeah,
rural Georgia.
And there's been a real sticky point with that for me, because I always think that, you know, like people's experience like shouldn't be benchmarked in terms of like what you feel is very, very real for you. If you feel like this thing, like you don't feel like you can be visible enough or queer enough or whatever however that manifests for you. But I do occasionally look back and think like there's not really, like the hate-based crime isn't the same. And some of the experiences in terms of like, you know, unions, and I mean, I lived in a state back home where I could be fired for my orientation or identity.
Wow.
So it's, you know, there are some things where I do draw comparisons and say, you know, there are protections here.
Absolutely.
You can be who you want to be, and there are forces in place to protect you.
With your work, how did you get to this job?
So I kind of I was on a very different career path before I left America, and I kind of had it in my head that I was going to be a professional creative writer at the time I was 30. And my trajectory was to immediately finish school, go to get my master's, my doctorate, and do screenwriting forever. When I knew that it was not going to be a possibility for me to stay in the States for that amount of time, or my circumstances had changed, I had to basically start from scratch. I kind of assumed that it'd be easy for me to get a job, considering, because I had a pretty big network in Atlanta. I had access to a lot of things. I grew up in a pretty privileged environment in that sense. I kind of naively thought that it was going to be easy for me to just hop a city and kind of latch into like the real world and real jobs. I found that was not the case, that people were like, we don't know this Atlanta school. We don't know any of your networks. Like, who are you? Where have you come from? So I pretty much had to start over. So I was working, I think, 6 days a week in a cafe for a period of time and volunteering and interning on my 7th. So just trying to get experience where I could, doing random interning gigs at various places across the city for a whole suite of people. But it wasn't actually until a friend of mine who I'd worked in a cafe with got a job at the Restaurant and Catering Association. And she called me up one day and was like, we're looking for a digital marketer. Like, can I send in your resume? And then I was like, absolutely. Sent it in. And then I've just been like working on building myself back up since then.
That's remarkable. And thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm very curious as well. I just wanted to sort of take a step back. As a non-binary individual, do you find that your identity is recognized in the corporate environment in which you thrive? Or?
I find it very difficult to talk about that at work. I think the corporate world in of itself is very slowly adapting to these types of changes. I think the conversations about non-binary people and pronouns particularly are very challenging because it's I think that humans generally really want to categorize, and they've been taught to deal with two categories, and so it's difficult for people to say, especially as an AFAB, and my colleagues often, gender me to that.
Sorry, just to contextualize an AFAB, what's
assigned female at birth.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So my colleagues, often gender me, and I have had a couple of conversations with them about that, but it's a learning process. Mm. So I'm not holding anyone at work to really any. I try not to take it personally. It's a conversation that's ongoing, and I've been working on trying to get some diversity and inclusion in programs happening at my work.
Fantastic. And what do you think, just to add to that, do you think that organizations can do better to support our community?
I think that there needs to be a lot more education. The events are great. It's great when companies are celebrating Mardi Gras, and, we saw a lot happening during like Pride Month, and people getting up and, putting the rainbow flags up their office and things like that. But I think that it would really be beneficial for people to have a conversation centered around educating people about language specifically, how that language manifests for identity, and how you can be addressing your colleagues appropriately.
And do you think that, it's harder or easier these days for, say, because as you being a 28-year-old, for older generations, do you think that's harder for them to catch on to? Or?
I don't necessarily think that it is harder. I think that it is newer, and I think that because older generations maybe didn't have the same playing field for expression that people today have, and a lot of that is, due to the hard work and the roads that they paved before I became an adult. And because of that leadership that they took on, there's now more room and more acceptance. But I think that people, thinking about the generations before me, the playing field wasn't as open or safe to really, explore these different types of expressions. And so it might seem newer to them in a sense, or maybe they don't feel as they know as many people in their community that experience the same thing. But it might just be a matter of, they didn't realize, or they didn't have the opportunity to pursue that expression.
I mean, do you think in your own experience, can you draw parallels from your experience to, say, older queer members of our community?
I think in some respects I can. I have a very unique story because of, people in Atlanta might have a very different experience to what I had, in the city might have a very different experience to my very country, southern, conservative upbringing. Certainly in terms of the conservative nature of that environment that I grew up in, I think that there are a lot of parallels to what life looked like a few decades ago, and how that silencing of expression played out throughout my childhood and early adulthood.
Mm. And just now in Sydney, do you have many connections, intergenerational connections in the queer community?
I have A few, but I would like to have more. I think something that I have really, really wanted for the longest time, and I think that a lot of other people who maybe are expatriates like myself really want, is that feeling of having like parents. So quote unquote parents, but it's like this experience of like, I wish I had somebody that I could just call, like, I can't call up my mom or dad to just like help me with, like, for example, I'm trying to buy a car at the moment and it's like, I've got no idea what I'm doing, what to check for, like, who do I call about this stuff? Like, I want a sturdy like person in my life who's had experience to say like, hey, I trust you. Can you help me make this decision? So there's a lot of that I like yearn for a lot. That kind of like, you've lived experiences. How would you advise me on this? And not just like simple stuff like making a purchase, but even like the complex issues that I face during the day. It's like, this issue arose for me, this altercation where somebody said something that was like, it felt a bit offensive to me, and I'm trying to work out why I feel this way. Can you help me unpack this? And someone who's got similar values, similar expression, or similar, experience can say, hey, like, I've experienced this. Here's what I did. Here's how it worked out for me. Here's what you can do. Here's what I can tell you.
Well, I'm sure people are watching this video and saying, oh, I'll do it.
Yeah. I hope so. Because like I would love that.
Why do you think that, these intergenerational connections are important in our community?
I think that the gaps are really not as big as we make them out to be. I think that part of the reason that there's this separation is that, at least from my experience, and this is a very like multifaceted answer to this question, but part of my experience, and one of the things that I'm trying to figure out how to navigate now, is that a lot of my time spent exploring the queer community has really been centered around like social events like parties. I think that people who, get a bit older, get a bit tired of the scene, don't end up going to those things anymore. It becomes very much like a young person's thing. So how do we incorporate like events or gathering spaces that aren't so much focused on this kind of like hard partying perspective, and then allowing the community a space to meet that's going to be available for people at all walks of life. I went to the protest, and it was really interesting to hear one of the 78ers get up and speak, because, they stood on stage and said, it's great to reclaim the streets, because this is what the original Mardi Gras was about. It was about out of the bars into the streets. Like, you can see us now. Like, we're not going anywhere. Like, visibility is key. I think it was really good to center the messaging back to its original form. It really reminded me how much work has already been paved already, and where the underlying issues are. And I think that we really can learn from history in terms of being able to progress change and moving forward. Our older community is to thank for that. They're the best historians that we have.
I mean, and surely even you have something to say and teach older generations. What would you say to people older than you in our community?
I would say to get your voice out there. There's a million ways to do that now. And I think that a lot of the older generation has been slower to come to technology with, nobody's fault, but it's just not maybe as readily as available, or all the social media stuff came a bit later. But I think there is a real opportunity for connectivity within like intergenerational people to have those relationships where they are having those conversations by plugging it through social media, or doing podcasts or whatever it looks like.
What do you think from your being a 28-year-old? What do you think in your experience and in your time up until now has been the most defining moment?
The day that I called my recruiter, so before I got this job that I'm in now, I called my recruiter crying because I dropped she, her pronoun for my partner during my interview. And I was terrified because I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like, I was in this interview and it was going really well, but I dropped my partner's pronouns during this meeting, and what if they decide that they don't want to hire me? And she first had to calm me down and be like, it's not the same as like your experience back home, because I was quite frazzled by it, and realized at that moment, one, how comfortable I'd gotten in talking about my life and my expression and identity, but also the lingering fear that I had from back home. And it was kind of around that time where I started to realize that I could let go of that fear, and I could kind of move forward with the rest of my life, making decisions for me, as opposed to presenting an expression that I think everyone else is going to want to see.
And I think we forget about, how far we've come now, being able to be more comfortable with expressing ourselves. How did you find out about Lesbians on the Loose?
Yeah, so I actually, when I moved to Australia, being a part of the queer community was huge for me. It was really important for me to see representation, and also to see other queer voices published. So hearing stories from people that identified as part of the community. And so one of the first things that I did when I moved was looked for all of the publications around the country that were going to be sharing voices like mine, that were going to be telling me about events that were events or artists who were, expressing their identity through different ways. And that was really important to me. Yeah, that's how I found LOTL. And
what does LOTL mean to you? I'm just going to throw that out there. What does LOTL mean to you?
Well, it was one of the first magazines that I read when I came over here. And so it was really that first point of like seeing other AFABs in the community kind of talking about their experiences, and reading about a lot of art, other work that had been going on. At the time, I think I remember reading an article about someone had been profiled who had won like a stencil art prize. And I remember just reading about like these really cool people in the industry and being like, hey, you know what? There's like actually a collective place where like I can see like people doing things that I'm interested in and hearing them talk about it. And it's not the, token diversity pick for another magazine. It's like everybody that's profiled has interesting stories to tell.
Adrien, thank you so much for your time, and thank you very much for sharing your story.
Yeah.
Thanks for hanging out with us. If you like our content, follow us and check out our website, lotl.com, to learn more.